In the summer of 2025, a research team at the University of Exeter split 75 people into two groups. 39 of them were under 30. The other 36 were in their 60s and 70s. Both groups drank the same thing, twice a day, for 2 weeks. Concentrated beetroot juice. Nothing else about their diets changed. A bit rough. The younger group's blood pressure barely moved. The older group's did. Not by a symbolic amount either. Enough that a doctor reviewing the numbers would call it clinically meaningful, the kind of drop that shows up on a follow-up visit and gets written into the chart. A bit rough. What the researchers found afterward was not really about the beets, it was about the mouth. Beetroot is loaded with dietary nitrate, and nitrate on its own does very little. It has to be converted into nitrite, and then into nitric oxide, before the body can use it to relax blood vessels. That conversion happens mostly in the mouth, courtesy of bacteria living on the back of the tongue. The older adults in the study, after 2 weeks of beet juice, had a different bacterial mix than when they started. More of a strain called Neisseria, less of one called Prevotella, which is associated with inflammation. Their mouths had gotten better at the one job that made the beets worth drinking in the first place. This is why a woman in her 60s and her 30-year-old granddaughter can eat the same bowl of roasted beets and walk away with different results. The granddaughter's conversion pathway was probably already efficient. The grandmother's had likely slowed with age, the way a lot of small biological machinery slows with age, and the beets gave it something to work with again. This is not universal, and it needs to be said plainly. A separate 2025 trial looked at older adults who were already being treated for high blood pressure with medication. 4 weeks of nitrate-rich beetroot juice changed their oral bacteria in a similar way. It did not produce a sustained drop in blood pressure or vascular function. 15 people, a controlled crossover design, a real result that simply did not match the Exeter findings. The honest reading of both studies together is that beets are not a replacement for blood pressure medication, and the response seems to depend on what medications a person is already taking, what their baseline health looks like, and which bacteria happen to be living in their mouth to begin with. None of that makes the compound itself less real. Nitric oxide is one of the most studied molecules in vascular biology. It signals the smooth muscle lining blood vessels to relax, which widens the vessel, which lowers the pressure the heart has to generate to push blood through it. This is the same pathway that nitroglycerin tablets exploit for angina, the same pathway that erectile dysfunction medications exploit, the same pathway distance runners have been chasing since beet juice showed up in exercise physiology labs over a decade ago, back when the interest was mostly about oxygen efficiency during a 10-kilometer race, rather than blood pressure at rest. The interest in dietary nitrate did not start in a cardiology department. It started with British and Swedish exercise physiologists in the late 2000s, feeding beet juice to trained cyclists and finding they used less oxygen to hold the same power output on a stationary bike. That result puzzled the field for a few years, because nobody expected a vegetable to change something as fundamental as mitochondrial efficiency. It took until the 2010s for researchers to trace the effect back to nitric oxide and the mitochondria's oxygen cost, and only in the past decade has the same pathway been re-examined in older, sedentary populations instead of 25-year-old athletes. The Exeter trial sits at the end of that 15-year drift, from a cycling lab to a geriatrics ward. There is a second layer to the mechanism that explains why age matters as much as it does. Arterial stiffness increases with age, largely independent of blood pressure itself, measured in vascular labs through something called pulse wave velocity, essentially how fast a pulse of pressure travels down an artery. Stiffer arteries transmit that pulse faster. Nitric oxide does not reverse decades of stiffening in 2 weeks, but it does relax the smooth muscle layer enough to blunt the pressure the heart feels on each beat, which is a different and more achievable target than reversing structural stiffness outright. This is a distinction cardiologists care about, and marketing copy usually erases. So here is what 30 mornings of beets actually looks like, mechanically, for someone past 60. Morning 1 changes nothing you can feel. The nitrate is in the bloodstream within a few hours, converted, circulating, doing its quiet work on vessel walls that have spent decades losing a little elasticity every year. You will not notice this. Blood pressure cuffs notice it before people do. By the end of the first week, if the Exeter numbers hold for a given individual, there is measurable movement, systolic pressure easing down by a handful of points, not dramatic. The kind of change that would not register on a home monitor read casually, but shows up when you write the numbers down every morning and look at the average across 7 days, instead of judging any single reading. The second week is where the oral microbiome shift becomes relevant, because it is not instant. Bacterial populations need repeated exposure to shift their balance, which is part of why a single beet salad at a dinner party does not produce a research paper's worth of results. Consistency is the mechanism, not the beet itself. Somebody eating beets once, feeling nothing, and concluding the whole thing is nonsense, has usually just stopped 1 week too early. Past 2 weeks, into the 3 and 4 week range that this 30-day window covers, the picture that emerges from the broader nitrate literature is less about a single number and more about a system operating with slightly less resistance. Circulation to the extremities, the kind that shows up as fewer cold fingers in a cool room. Blood reaching muscle tissue a little more efficiently during a walk up a flight of stairs, which is the same reason competitive cyclists started drinking beet juice before time trials in the first place, just applied to a body whose daily time trial is grocery shopping and grandchildren. There is also potassium in beets, and betalains, the pigment compounds responsible for that deep red color, which carry their own antioxidant and anti-inflammatory properties independent of the nitrate pathway entirely. A person eating beets every morning for a month is not isolating one mechanism. They are getting several at once, layered on top of each other, which is part of why nutrition research on whole foods is messier and slower than research on a single isolated compound in a capsule. A woman I will call Diane, because she asked not to use her real name when she mentioned this to her doctor, started roasting a beet every night and eating half of it cold the next morning with her breakfast, the other half saved for the following day. By the 3rd week she noted, almost as an aside, that her ankles were not swelling by evening the way they had been the previous winter. Ankle swelling and blood pressure are not the same thing, and nothing here proves the beets caused the change, rather than the warmer weather or a dozen other variables in an ordinary life. But it is the kind of small, hard-to-quantify shift that shows up in real people well before it shows up in a published trial, and it is worth naming precisely because it is not dramatic. Nobody's grandmother had a health transformation from a root vegetable. What happened, if anything happened, was quieter than that. None of this requires beet juice specifically. The Exeter study used a concentrated shot because it standardizes the dose for a clinical trial. Whole roasted beets, beet powder stirred into water, pickled beets from a jar, all deliver nitrate, just in different concentrations and alongside different amounts of sugar, depending on preparation. A person avoiding blood sugar spikes would lean toward whole roasted beets over commercial juice, which tends to be concentrated enough to matter. This is a detail that gets lost when a headline compresses a nuanced study into 11 words. Beets are not the only nitrate source, and someone who genuinely cannot stand the taste has options. Arugula and spinach carry comparable or higher nitrate concentrations by weight. Celery does too, in smaller amounts. What beets bring that leafy greens do not is convenience and shelf stability. A vegetable that survives a week in a refrigerator drawer without wilting, roasts in under an hour, and does not need to be eaten in the volume a salad would require to match the dose used in the clinical trials. That practicality is probably underrated in why beets became the research vegetable of choice, rather than, say, arugula, which nobody wants to eat a full bowl of at 7 in the morning. There are 2 caveats here, and neither one should be softened. Beets are high in oxalates, and people with a history of calcium oxalate kidney stones should talk to a doctor before making them a daily habit, since oxalate intake is one of several factors that can raise stone risk in susceptible individuals. And nitrate-rich vegetables can interact with certain blood pressure medications and with nitrate-based drugs prescribed for heart conditions, compounding the blood vessel relaxing effect in a way that is not automatically dangerous, but is worth a conversation with whoever manages that prescription. Neither caveat is a reason to avoid beets. Both are reasons to mention the habit out loud at the next appointment, rather than treat it as a secret. The dose used in most of the clinical literature sits somewhere around 1 large beet, or roughly 200 milliliters of concentrated juice, once or twice a day. Timing matters less than people assume. Nitrate does not need to be taken on an empty stomach or paired with anything in particular to be absorbed, though using an antibacterial mouthwash regularly can blunt the whole process, since it kills the same oral bacteria responsible for the nitrite conversion. A person rinsing with mouthwash twice a day and eating beets once a day is working against themselves without realizing it, which is a detail that shows up in the nitrate research more often than it shows up in nutrition advice columns. The effect also does not bank itself for later. Nitric oxide has a short half-life, measured in minutes, and the downstream vascular relaxation it produces does not persist for days after the last dose. This is why the studies measure blood pressure during the intervention window and shortly after, not months afterward. Stop eating beets, and within roughly 1 to 2 weeks, the oral microbiome shift the Exeter team measured would likely drift back toward baseline, though nobody has published the exact decay curve. The habit is the mechanism as much as the vegetable is. A month of beets is not a debt paid off. It is closer to a bank account that stops earning interest the day deposits stop. What 30 days will not do is fix blood pressure that requires medical intervention or replace a conversation with a physician about existing hypertension, particularly for someone already on medication, given that the treated hypertension study found the microbiome changed without the blood pressure following it down. What it appears to do, based on the healthy older adult data, is give a body whose nitric oxide production has slowed with age a dietary shortcut back to something closer to its earlier efficiency, assuming the mouth bacteria cooperate, which for most people, given 2 weeks of consistent exposure, they eventually do. A 68-year-old finishing this 30-day window is not a different person. They are the same person with vessels that resist blood flow a little less than they did a month earlier, a mouth that has quietly rebuilt part of its bacterial population, and a habit, which in the long run may matter more than any single morning's reading, because the study that found results used 2 weeks as its minimum, not its ceiling, and the researchers themselves have not yet published what 6 months or a year of this looks like. That question is still open. The Exeter team's next phase is expected to look at duration beyond the initial 2-week window, though as of this recording, that data has not been published.